Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the event on whether and how we can build a more equal education system. This is part of a series of events that we're running as part of the ESRC's Festival of Social Science, and it's drawing very much on the background and the material that we've set out in our Deaton Review chapter on educational inequalities. That's part of a long-running big project at IFS, looking at inequality through many different dimensions and trying to build the evidence base for what we know and what we don't know. It's quite a timely event to have here today because just this morning, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has announced that he views education as the silver bullet for what we can do in policy to help drive growth and bring the UK forward into the next decade and beyond. But what do we know about what we've seen in the past few decades in the education system, and what do we know about inequalities in that system? Today, we're joined by Imran Tahir, a research economist here at the IFS, who will be talking to us for about 30 or 40 minutes about inequalities in the education system. After that, we'll have a Q&A. So if you do have questions throughout the talk, please do post them on Slido, and we'll be keeping an eye on that chat. If somebody has already posted a question that you think is really, really compelling and really interesting, do upvote it, and we'll try and take those ratings into account as well. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Imran to tell us about how we can build a more equal education system.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining this session today about how we can build a more equal education system. As Christine has mentioned, this is based on a report we published earlier this year entitled Education Inequalities as part of the Deaton Review of Inequalities. Now, education inequalities are an emotive subject. There's a lot of concern among policymakers, teachers, parents, and the general public about the scale of education inequalities. And some of these concerns are highlighted in the newspaper headlines you can see on the screen at the moment. What these headlines also show is the fact that educational inequalities involves a range of different issues. So on the screen, you can see headlines related to funding and how funding varies by school type. You can see headlines on the value of different education qualifications, headlines on how certain groups of children, for instance, children from poorer backgrounds, those from Black Caribbean backgrounds, do worse at school, and also in the bottom right, the impact of COVID on educational inequalities. So educational inequalities covers a wide range of different topics and different issues. That's why it's so important to try and make sense of the nature of education inequalities before we move on to analyzing and assessing what exactly can be done about them. And that's really what I'm going to try and do in this presentation, provide you with the stories and evidence behind the headlines to build up a picture of educational inequalities at the moment. So what I'm going to try and do in this presentation is answer the following 5 questions. Firstly, why should we worry about educational inequalities? Secondly, when do educational inequalities develop? Thirdly, who fares poorly and well in the education system? Are there certain groups of children and young people that are doing especially badly? Fourthly, what are the issues with the existing education system? And then finally, based on what we found in our answers to the first 4 questions, how can we build a more equal education system? So before we jump into that, I think a few caveats are necessary. As I say, educational inequalities is a huge topic. We've only got a full 30 to 40 minutes here to present and talk about it. So I'm not going to be able to cover many important issues which are important to analyzing and assessing educational inequalities. A second caveat is that our focus here is going to be particularly on the English education system. However, the lessons that we draw will carry implications and important findings both for education systems in the other UK nations and internationally. And if you do find this interesting, the full report, a full Deaton report on educational inequalities is available online. So let's jump into those 5 questions. Firstly, why should we worry about educational inequalities? Well, one simple answer is that people with higher levels of education tend to earn more. So this chart shows you the earnings trajectories of individuals by their highest qualification level. And you can see that individuals with degrees, the red line here, they earn substantially more at each age. In fact, at the age of 40, an individual with a degree earns almost twice as much as someone with the lowest qualification level here. And these earnings differences are salient at even very young ages. So here I'm showing you the distribution of earnings amongst employees based on whether they have a GCSE qualification or a degree at the age between the ages of 25 to 30. You can see that people with degrees, those in green, are towards the right of this distribution. They tend to earn more. Amongst those who are qualified up to GCSE level, the most common earnings threshold is between 15 to 20,000. About a quarter of people who are qualified up to GCSE level fall within this earnings range. But the real difference between people with different levels of qualifications is their earnings growth. What you can see here is the distribution of earnings for people between the ages of 45 and 50. What's really quite striking is that for GCSE, people qualified up to GCSE level, the most common earnings threshold highlighted in red here is still 15 to 20,000 pounds. There's very little earnings progression. In contrast, university graduates tend to earn more. We see more people towards the right of this distribution, earning those higher levels of income. So there are important differences in earnings, but people with higher levels of education also do better across a range of other outcomes. There's a lot of evidence showing that individuals with higher levels of education tend to have better health, both mental and physical health, higher levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of civic participation, and actually their children tend to have better outcomes as well. And so educational inequalities are at the root of so many different societal inequalities, which is why we should be so concerned about them. So when do educational inequalities develop? There are significant differences in the level of qualifications of young people. Here I'm showing you the distribution of qualifications for at age 26 for a cohort of English young people in England. You can see by the age of 26, about a third of these individuals have earned a degree. There are also quite a few people who have low levels of qualifications up to level 1 or level 2. So that's GCSE level or below, and a few people in between. We can actually trace these differences in educational attainment at the age of 26 back to what happened a decade earlier, at the point at which people took their GCSEs. So here I'm showing you the relationship between GCSE attainment and people's educational attainment at the age of 26. Specifically, I'm dividing people up into 10 groups based on their GCSE attainment and showing you the distribution of qualifications among these individuals at the age of 26. So to take an example here, if we look at the far left-hand decile, the first decile, these are people with the worst GCSE results at the age of 16, and we can see 55% don't progress up to level 1, and 31% are still at level 2. So that's GCSE level or below. As we move towards the right of this distribution, people become more, have done better in their GCSEs. We see higher rates of education. In fact, amongst the top group here, almost 80% go on to complete a degree. So age 16, attainment tracks into age 26 attainment, but we can go further back. Here I'm showing you the relationship between GCSE attainment and age 11 attainment. So that's attainment at the end of primary school. So for among children who were above the expected level at the end of primary school, almost 93% of them achieve pass grades in English and maths GCSEs, whereas those who were below the expected level at the end of primary school, only 8% meet the same educational benchmark. And we can go even further back. So here we look at attainment at the end of primary school against attainment at the age of 7. So kids who did very well at the age of 7, say for instance, they were above the expected level, almost all of them go on to achieve at least the expected level at the age of 11, at the end of primary school. So differences in educational attainment appear quite early on in the school system. But actually, we can go even further back. Even before children have started school, there are quite substantial differences in their levels of skills. So here I'm showing you the relationship between early cognitive skills, so cognitive skills at the age of 3, and the proportion of students who go on to achieve 5 good GCSEs, A star to C. You can see there's a positive relationship between early cognitive skills and GCSE attainment. So educational inequalities really do emerge quite early on. So far we've been looking at education across the population, but are there specific groups within specific groups of children who do particularly well and particularly badly in the education system? And one thing that may not be surprising to you is that there are quite substantial socio-economic gaps in educational attainment. So children from poor households tend to do worse at school. And to show that, let's return to that cohort of young people we were looking at before and their distribution of qualifications at the age of 26. So the first bar here for the entire cohort shows the breakdown of qualifications for the entire cohort. You can see that about a third of these young people have achieved a degree at the age of 26, whereas a third haven't gone past level 2. So they're at GCSE level or below, and there are a few people in between that. So that's quite a balanced distribution of qualifications across the population. However, when we look at this same distribution, but for within the most deprived quintile, so that's children from the young people from the 20% worst off households, you see that very few go on to achieve a degree. In fact, just over half of these young people don't progress beyond GCSE level. In contrast, for the least deprived quintile and private school students, just 19% and 8% of private school students fail to progress beyond GCSE standard. In fact, the majority of these kids from better off backgrounds go on to complete a degree at university. In fact, 71% of private school students have completed a degree by the age of 26. But actually, all of these inequalities trace back to earlier stages. So here I'm showing you attainment gaps by whether or not a student was eligible for free school meals. So this corresponds to children from the worst of 15 to 20% of households against all other students. You can see that at every single age, there's a significant gap between children from the worst off households and those from better off households. And actually, one of the things that's so concerning is that this disadvantage gap between children from the worst off families and the rest of the student population seems to have remained fairly constant over time. So this chart shows you GCSE performance by eligibility for free school meals between 2006 up until 2019. And you can see that in every single year, children who are eligible for free school meals do significantly worse. And the really striking thing about this chart is that the size of this disadvantage gap seems to have remained pretty constant throughout this period. Now, so far, we've been looking at disadvantage as a binary sort of thing, comparing children from the worst off households versus the rest of the population. But actually, there's a continuous relationship between household income and educational attainment, which is illustrated by this chart here. This chart shows you GCSE attainment by decile of household income. So we've divided children into 10 groups based on their household income and plotted the relationship between household income and GCSE attainment. And you can see that there's a continuous relationship between household income and measures of GCSE attainment. So children from better off households do better in their GCSEs. Now, one of the quite interesting things about that is when we look at the deciles 8, 9, and 10, so these are kids from the best of households, we see very little difference in the share achieving 5 good GCSEs, including English and maths. Where we do see a difference, though, is those achieving the top grades, the A to A star grades, where there's a clear gradient. So there's a continuous relationship between household income and educational attainment. As children come from better off households, they do better in school and at the end of school. So socioeconomic differences are one important dimension. There are many other important differences here. Particular gender is an important dimension. Girls outperform boys at school, which is illustrated by this chart here, shows attainment gaps between by gender at different ages. You can see that at every single age, girls outperform boys in the school. However, this doesn't translate into better labor market outcomes. Now, there are a variety of different reasons why there is a gender wage gap between men and women. However, one of the reasons why for the gender wage gap is the fact that men and women make fairly different subject choices. So in this chart, I'm showing you the percentage of female students studying different degree subject areas. Overall, about 57% of university students are female. That's what you can see in the red bar here. However, females are overrepresented in certain subjects, such as subjects allied to medicine. So this is typically nursing. They're also overrepresented in education, in veterinary science, in languages. At the bottom, though, very few women take STEM subjects, economics, and it's really these subjects that tend to have high earnings in the labor market, which is part of the reason why we still see a gender wage gap, even though women are doing and girls are doing so much better in the classroom. What about differences by ethnicity? So differences by ethnicity is a slightly more nuanced story. Young people from non-white backgrounds start out behind, but they seem to make faster progress through the schooling system. Here I'm showing you attainment gaps between ethnic minority pupils and white pupils. At the age of 5, you can see that each ethnic minority group performs worse than white British students, but as we progress to older ages, with the exception of Black students, all other ethnic groups perform better at age 11 and age 16. And actually, every single ethnic minority group is more likely to progress to university than white British pupils. In this chart, we show you progression to higher education at the age of 19 by ethnicity. The first bar in both of these groups of bar charts shows you the proportion of white British students attending university and attending the most selective universities. You can see that every single ethnic minority is more likely to attend university. And there are also fairly substantial differences between different ethnic minority groups here. So far, we've been looking at differences in terms of personal characteristics. However, the levelling up agenda has placed an emphasis on the importance of where students come from geographically. Now, one of the things we see is that pupils in London perform far better than students in other areas of the country. This chart shows you the proportion of students achieving the expected level at the end of primary school in different local authorities. You can see that amongst the blue local authorities in blue here, the London authorities, they're far more likely to have higher levels of primary school achievement. Even the worst performing local authorities in London are doing better than those outside of the capital. And just putting all of these different dimensions together, you can see that there are, and this shows differences in GCSE attainment. Once again, we see that young people from poor backgrounds do substantially worse at GCSE level, seeing that girls do better. There are also ethnic and geographical differences in educational attainment. So far, we've been looking at each of these dimensions separately, but actually the intersections between these different dimensions are really important. By that, I mean we need to consider each of these dimensions in conjunction with each other. Now, this chart shows you GCSE performance by students' eligibility for free school meals, their gender and their ethnicity. So where there's quite a lot going on in this chart, and there are a range of interesting stories that you can tell from this chart, but one I want to highlight to you is the fact that the disadvantage gap, that's the gap between pupils who are eligible for free school meals and the rest of the pupils, is actually largest amongst white British pupils. It's what I've circled here. You can also consider all of these different dimensions together and look at the predictive power of these different dimensions. When we consider the joint role of gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geography in explaining pupils' GCSE attainment, we see that the clearest predictor is income. Income's the biggest household income is the biggest predictor of educational attainment. However, there are still important roles for gender, ethnicity, and also geography as well. So we've painted a picture of educational inequalities. We've shown that there are quite pervasive and large gaps between different groups of students. What are the issues that are contributing to these educational inequalities? Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are a range of other issues that we could consider here. But potentially one of the biggest contributors is the large differences in resources that are available to different schools. This is one of the key determinants of the quality of education that young people receive. So if we compare the resources available in state schools to private schools, we see that there's a really quite large gap. So this chart shows you the per pupil spending for state schools in blue here against the per pupil spending in private schools in green. In the 2010, this gap was about £3,000, but it's over doubled in the last decade. So it's now over £6,000. So there's this significant gap in the resources available to private and state school pupils. But even within the state school system, school funding seems to have become less progressive over time. So what we've done here to track the progressivity of school funding is we've grouped every single school into one of 5 categories based on the proportion of students who are eligible for free school meals. So in particular, the red line here shows you quintile 5, the most deprived school. So these are the schools with the highest share of students from FSM backgrounds. And we've compared the funding per pupil that each of these schools receive relative to the least deprived schools. So in the early 2000s, we see a number of about 1.2 for the most deprived schools. That means that these schools received were able to spend around about 20% more per pupil than the least deprived schools. And actually over the early 2000s, funding became more progressive. So we see an increase in this relative level of funding relative to the least deprived schools. But since 2012, we've seen a decline in the progressivity of funding. So resources are, of course, one really important aspect, but actually it matters how schools are using this funding. And the other key factor is the effectiveness of the teaching that students are receiving. Now, there's some evidence that disadvantaged schools are less likely to have high quality teachers. Particular teachers are less likely to hold a degree in their subject area, and also are less likely to be judged good or outstanding by the school's regulator, Ofsted. And this is illustrated by the following chart. So this chart shows you Ofsted ratings for the quality of teaching, learning, and assessment within different schools, where we've divided each school based on the share of pupils who are eligible for free school meals. You can see that the most deprived schools, I should say the schools with the highest share of deprived students, so 1 and 2 here, they're far less likely to have good or outstanding teaching, learning, and assessment. As we move up the distribution, we see a higher share of good and outstanding teaching. So we've looked a lot at differences in schools, but post-16 education, it is also a massive factor. Post-16 education has the potential to close educational inequalities that emerge during the school years. However, over the past decade or so, there seems to have been a decline in the chances available for students who don't attend university. This is highlighted by this chart, shows the total number of adult learners in England over the past decade. And what we can see is that there's been a massive decline in the number of low-level learners. So these are learners who may not have achieved what they wanted to at school, and therefore take these low-level qualifications in order to upskill and gain the skills that they need. We've seen that over the past decade, there's been a really sharp decline in the number of these students. In addition to that, those people who are receiving the highest level of training at work tend to be those who are already highly qualified. And this chart shows you the share of workers receiving employer-provided training in the last 3 months by their qualification level. You can see that there's a positive relationship between one's level of educational attainment and their likelihood of receiving training. So as opposed to reducing gaps in educational inequalities, it seems to be the case that training is actually focused to those who are already highly skilled. What all of this means is that many young people and adults alike are getting stuck in the education system. This is highlighted by this rather complicated looking chart, which shows the flow of educational attainment between the ages of 16, 19, and 26. Now, you take 2 key things from this chart. Firstly, there are quite a few people who progress fairly seamlessly between these ages and through the education system. So there are quite a high share of people who successfully complete their GCSEs, then they've completed A-levels, academic level 3 by the age of 19, and they go on to university and get a degree. However, at the bottom end of this chart, we also see quite a high share of young people who don't do so well in their GCSEs and at school, and then they simply don't recover they don't gain the qualifications that they should do and are really necessary for the success in the labor market. In fact, as we've seen already, there are a high share of people in their 20s and adults who don't even have qualifications beyond GCSE level. So what have we learned so far? So we've seen that educational inequalities matter because they're at the root of many societal level inequalities. These educational inequalities become salient at very early ages and seem to persist throughout the school years through to adulthood. We've also seen that there are certain groups who perform particularly badly at school, in particular those who come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. We've highlighted some of the issues with the existing education system. So how can we build a more equal education system? So here I'm going to provide you with some of the principles and guidelines that policymakers should take into account when designing policy to try and move towards a more equal education system. Firstly, as we've highlighted, educational inequalities is quite a complex issue. In order to make progress, we need to be careful about defining what exactly the problems are. So in particular, what types of inequalities are we referring to? Are we talking about inequalities in education? So these inequalities between different groups of young people? Or do we mean inequalities by education? So the fact that if you don't do a degree, you're far less likely to be earning high wages. Which of those inequalities are we trying to tackle? Secondly, is it enough to look at educational inequalities themselves, or do we need to solve wider social issues? And thirdly, we shouldn't just be focusing on reducing inequalities per se. We should also take into account whether what we really mean is boosting skills at the bottom of the skills distribution. So in terms of broad guiding principles for policymakers, we've emphasized in our review of inequalities is the need and the importance of thinking about the education system holistically. We've seen that educational inequalities emerge at quite a young age, which is why early interventions are so crucial, but these really have to be followed up at various different stages of the education system. And at every stage, resources are crucial, both their level and how these resources are spent. It's really critical that our education system provides people with the opportunities that they need, the second chances for those who don't do well at school, and also a means to reskill and upskill. And thirdly, we need to look outside of the education system too. So we've seen that young household income and family background is very predictive of how young people do at school and their educational attainment. In order to equalize and make the entire education system more equal, we also need to think about how health, social services, economics, housing policy, taxes, and benefits are all part of the solution. So there are quite a few sobering messages through this presentation. I do want to leave on an optimistic note though. So, reasons for hope. Young people in the UK today are more qualified than ever. We've also made progress, significant progress in boosting the educational attainment among many disadvantaged groups. So women and ethnic minorities, even if this doesn't always translate into success in the labor market. And I think there's a broad consensus, and all of us really have an interest in raising skills and developing second chances. This not only benefits individuals, but society as a whole. And if we do take steps to make our education system more equal, then education really can be an engine for social mobility. Thank you so much for listening, and we will now turn to the question and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Imran. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and you crammed a ton of information and a ton of analysis into just half an hour. So there are already lots of questions on the Slido, but do continue to put your questions there as they come up in our discussion. And to start us off, Imran, there's one that's kind of raced to the top of the Slido here, really asking about how do educational inequalities interact with other dimensions of inequality that we have in society, income inequality or wealth inequality or geographic inequalities. And what does that mean when children are growing up in very unequal environments? How does that translate into educational inequalities, and how much can the school system realistically do to overcome those very different experiences that children are having at home?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the key messages from our review, is the fact that in order to tackle educational inequalities, we can't just focus on what happens in the education system. So in terms of the relationship between education and all of these other outcomes, we focused on earnings differences, but actually education is important for health, family well-being, a whole host of different outcomes. And it's not just the fact that education benefits the individual who's being benefited. There are loads of positive spillovers for one's family, but also society as a whole from having a more educated workforce. So that's why I think we've really got to try and think about this holistically. Solving educational inequalities won't just be done by fixing or improving the education system. It's going to take more wide-ranging reform that touches upon a range of different policy areas.
Yeah, and I suppose that's kind of one of the reasons that we've done this piece of work as part of the IFS's Deaton review of inequalities, really, is to say that, okay, yes, there's educational inequalities and there's all of the complexity and all of the importance around those issues, but they're both cause and consequence of some of these other dimensions of inequality that we're exploring throughout the review. So Imran, you sort of alluded to the fact that when we think about the benefits of education, we're thinking not just about the labor market differences, the earnings differences, the employment differences, but also all of these other outcomes, happiness or life satisfaction or health or crime. And there's a question on the Slido asking about the direction of causality for that. So how much can we say that this is really about the impact of education on those other outcomes? Is this about actually people who are happier or more satisfied tend to do better in education, and so is the causal direction kind of going in the other way? Or is it just the case that there's kind of a whole mess of these factors that are all correlated with each other, and it's quite difficult to disentangle what we can say with confidence is the causal relationship?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of evidence on the economic returns to education and the general returns to education. What are the benefits of being more educated? And one of the key issues with all of this evidence is, as you say, there's so many other differences between people with different levels of education. So people who have gone on to university, completed a degree, they'll probably have very different lives to someone who, for instance, hasn't progressed from beyond GCSE level. So family background is one of the key differences, but there will also be a lot of other societal differences, which makes it very difficult for researchers to pin down what exactly is the causal contribution of education to these specific outcomes. However, there have been a lot of studies that have tried to address this exact question, looking, for instance, at the causal relationship between one's education and your level of happiness. And they've tried to use different sources of variation to try and pinpoint this causal relationship. And there is causal evidence that education does improve a range of different outcomes.
So given that this is the Festival of Social Science and the studies you're talking about, I think are really good examples of good social science and what we can learn from that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what are some of the methods that researchers have used to try and really pin down that causal link?
Yes. So one of the studies that I've seen has used the fact that the school leaving age was raised in the UK. So in particular, I think during the 1970s, the age at which young people were able to leave school was raised from 15 to 16. So by comparing in young people just before this cutoff with those just after the cutoff, we can compare the impact of having an additional year of education on earnings outcomes, but also these other outcomes.
Yeah, I think those are such interesting studies, and it's such a good example of the power that kind of really good, careful social science can let you get a handle on something that when you first start looking into it, you might think it's all just a mess and we're never going to be able to get anywhere with it. I think those are really, really nice pieces of evidence. We have quite a lot of questions, I guess, coming back to this theme of income inequalities and how does what's happening at home relate to what's happening at school. We have one question about the early educational inequalities that you showed. I think you showed them for 3-year-olds already, quite large gaps. Obviously, 3-year-olds are not by and large in the schooling system. They might be in formal childcare, but how should we think about those very early inequalities? How should we think about the influences on those inequalities opening up so early in life?
But I think what those early inequalities highlight is the fact that there's a lot of stuff that happens outside of school, which is really important. In particular, the role that families and your home learning environment plays on your attainment, but also your development. And I think this really hammers home the message that we do need to look just beyond the education system. There's only so much the education system can do. Well, your family and your home learning environment is going to have a massive impact on your educational attainment. And I think this is actually one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted. So the pandemic obviously created a situation where young people couldn't go to school. Of course, there was a move to online learning. However, what we've seen is that there are massive differences in the learning experience that young people had. In particular, young people from better off families who had the resources that they needed to, for instance, computers at home and more engaged parents typically, they tended to do better during this period or not as worse. So again, it really does highlight the importance of home learning environment.
Yeah, I think some of the statistics that we're seeing on lost learning or children not making as much progress as they would have hoped to during the pandemic are deeply sobering, and should really emphasize underpin a lot of the policy response that's going on in the education department in the coming years, because there has been a lot of damage done there, and there's a big question about, given the importance of educational attainment, what we can do to help those children catch back up. One question about that is really about the role of a specific policy, in particular the pupil premium. So I think this is referring to those really interesting charts you showed on school funding becoming somewhat less progressive over the last decade or so. How can you talk us through a little bit more? What are the mechanisms behind that, and what does this tell us about the role of pupil premium?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So on those charts, which showed that school funding seems to have become less progressive over time. There are quite a few factors that contribute to the trends that we see. So one of the changes that we've seen over the past decade is that there have been changes in the number of pupils who are eligible for free school meals. In particular, there's been a decrease in the level of pupils eligible for free school meals, certainly prior to the pandemic. As a result, we see it's natural that we'd see less funding being directed to schools with higher shares of disadvantaged pupils. So that's one of the reasons why we see education funding seeming to get less progressive over time. We've also seen a change in the location of schools with high shares of disadvantaged pupils. Particular schools in London seem to have seen particularly big declines in the share of students with who are eligible for free school meal funding, which is one of the reasons, again, why we see that pattern that I highlighted in the chart. But in terms of the per pupil premium, so these weren't conscious policy decisions. These are changes in composition, changes in demographics, which have changed the relative progressivity of school funding. However, for a large part of between 2010 and 2020, the per pupil premium rather was actually frozen in cash terms, which means in real terms we've seen a decline in the funding that's targeted at these disadvantaged pupils.
Yeah, I think so. A combination of kind of unintended consequences of shifting demographics over time and space, and then potentially unintended but very real policy decisions being made about not having pupil premium increase in line with inflation. And of course, in the current environment where inflation is so very much higher than we've all sort of gotten used to over the last few decades, that becomes, those kinds of stealth freezes become ever more important. In terms of the policy environment, we have a few questions kind of asking again about this interplay between what's going on at home and then what's going on in the school. And so asking about what we can really do about this. What would be the more effective way of supporting disadvantaged learners, given that you've shown the disadvantage gap has been really very stubborn over time and potentially has gotten quite, well, not potentially, has gotten quite a bit worse over the pandemic period. So what kinds of policies would you throw in the mix?
So I think there is no easy solution here. What we've seen is that this disadvantage gap has remained fairly constant for the past couple of decades, in spite of many different policy reforms. So I think if you look at the agendas of most governments over the past decades, one of their key priorities will be tackling educational inequalities. So there's not been a lack of trying. Different policies have been trialed, but we don't seem to have made much progress in improving the outcomes of these young people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Yeah, and it's we do have a lot of evidence in England from the Education Endowment Foundation and others about what seems to work at closing that disadvantage gap. But I think it comes back to the discussion we were having earlier as well about how much we can realistically expect schools to do when they're operating in an environment where children have very, very different experiences at home.
Well, one thing I would just add to this, and we haven't really covered this, but the role of choices within the education system. So at various different stages, there are either parents, teachers, students themselves are making choices about the type of education and the education route that young people are taking. So even before starting schools, parents have to decide which school to send their child. There's evidence that the richer parents are able to send their children to better schools. There's a whole the whole question about how we redesign school choices to make it a more equitable system. But then turning to when these young people have completed education, they've done their GCSEs, they're deciding whether or not to go on to university, which types of degrees to study. Here, information is really important, and I think there's a lot of evidence that there are big information deficits for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, which contribute to some of the educational inequalities that I've shown you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those decisions that people make within the education system can be very important shapers of the outcomes that they end up with. One particular type of decision, I suppose, is the decision that some parents make to send their children to private school. So we have a question that's been rising up the ranks very quickly, which I think will always come when doing a chapter on educational inequalities, about whether having a more equal education system is really compatible with having a system that allows for private and independent schools in it.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. I think when you talk about educational inequalities, one of the solutions many people mention is abolishing private schools. Now, I don't think, firstly, it's worth saying that kids who attend private schools do very well for themselves, disproportionately well. However, we're talking about a very small subset of the population. So about 7% of kids currently attend private schools. If we were to abolish private schools, though, I don't think that would completely resolve all of the issues we're seeing. Even if every school was a state school, I think we'd still have parents who, with the means, able to send their kids to the better state schools. In fact, that's what we see within the state school system. So grammar schools, for instance, it's typically parents who are able to afford to live in areas where there are grammar schools and have access to the resources to provide their children with the tutoring that they need to pass their 11+ exams, that get their kids into these grammar schools.
Yeah,
so,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry, no, go.
I was going to move on to the next question, but if you wanted to, okay. Yeah, I think that question, that policy judgment around independent schools is one that's important to this debate, but can sometimes have a way of overwhelming this debate. And I think what your presentation made very, very clear is that there's a lot of good that we can do in bringing up the bottom, and that has quite big economic gains as well as quite big gains for improving educational equality. And perhaps some of those groups have historically not been focused on quite as much as we might have hoped, particularly in the vocational education sector. There's one very early question here about another way of benchmarking educational inequalities in England, and really thinking about them in international comparison. So what can we say about educational inequalities in England or in the UK, and how that compares to what's going on in other countries?
Yeah, so this is it's very difficult to make these sorts of comparisons because the educational systems vary so much between different countries. So even within the UK, you see that the educational systems across the different nations are very different. And in particular, the qualifications that people are taking are very different. So there's a whole host of different qualifications in Scotland relative to England, which makes a comparison of the level of inequalities, educational inequalities, even between Scotland and England, very difficult. Now, there is some saying that there are international surveys of skills. So I think the most famous one is PISA, which looks at skill levels at the age of 16. there has been some work comparing the level of attainment of young people on using PISA across the UK nations. What we see on those rankings, the latest rankings, is that students in England typically do better than in the other nations, but Welsh students will really perform way below the level of attainment in the other nations.
Yeah, very interesting. We have several questions which I'm going to sort of attempt to lump together about measurement and data. So one of them is basically what data are we using? Where do all of these pretty graphs even come from? But then a little bit more specifically, there's a question about the inequalities by ethnicity that you show, asking about whether this could be the effect of children being first-generation immigrants and being speaking English as an additional language, needing to learn the language first and then being able to overcome that early barrier and catch up and indeed overtake later on in their schooling careers. And then another question about Ofsted and the charts that you showed looking at Ofsted's assessment of teaching quality across schools with different levels of disadvantage, and sort of making the point that actually it might be quite a lot easier to do all of those great things that they teach you in teacher college if you're in a classroom with better off children who aren't contending with some of the disadvantages at home that we've been talking about so much. So yes, do you want to take one of those three questions?
Okay, yeah, I will try and address all of them fairly briefly. So in terms of what data we use a whole host of different data sets. So our primary data sources are from the Department of Education. We use national statistics that the department has published, and these are primarily on England. We also use administrative data. So we have access to the National Pupil Database, and we've used that to look at some of the educational inequalities. We've also used the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a panel data set which follows a group of 20,000 young people from 2000 up until the present day. What I would say is, if you are interested in finding out more about the data, do read the report. We've referenced everything very carefully, so you should have no issues finding out which data sets we've used. In terms of the inequalities by ethnicity and sort of what are the drivers behind the patterns that we see. So I don't think anyone has come to a definitive conclusion about why exactly children from an ethnic minority background seem to start behind white British students and then catch up, and most surpass them at the age of 16. I do agree that English as another language is potentially one of the reasons why it could be the case that it does take them a bit of time to learn English at school and then learn everything else that they need to as part of the curriculum. In terms of the Ofsted assessment question, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the fact that it must be so much more difficult for a teacher trying to teach a classroom where there are potentially quite disruptive students. The only thing I would say is it's very difficult to measure teacher effectiveness. I think this is one of the few measures that we have to try and to be able to compare the levels of teacher effectiveness across the country, which is why we've used these Ofsted measures.
Yeah, and I think you were quite careful. I think on your slide you talked about outstanding teaching rather than outstanding teachers, and so even if the same teacher would be able to perform much better and much more to the standard that they learn about and the standard that they wish to perform to when they have an easier class, you still end up in a situation where the children in that easier class, in that better off school, are being exposed to teaching that is closer to what the teachers, I'm sure, all want to be able to deliver. We have only about 1 minute left, so I'm going to put to you a complaint that we haven't said enough about mainstream 16 to 18 education, sixth forms, FE colleges, which I know is your particular area of expertise and interest, and it sounds from this morning's newspapers like an area of interest for the Prime Minister as well. So what would be your top recommendations when it comes to the 16 to 18 system?
So my top recommendation to this the person who's made this complaint is do read the chapter. We've got a whole section on post-16 education, so don't worry, it's not neglected. So in terms of this morning's announcements, we've seen the Prime Minister set out that improving skills and further education is going to be a key component of his strategy for the country. And I think some of the changes that have been mooted are quite positive. So this move to broaden the 16 to 18 education curriculum, I think, is a much needed move. Our current education system is far too narrow. What I would say, though, is there still needs to be second chances and chances for young people who don't do well at school. There has to be some systems in place for these young people to achieve the qualifications that they need. But also later on in life, there have to be opportunities for adults to retrain, reskill, especially given today's economy, where we're constantly changing the types of skills that are in demand. And therefore, as an education, we've got to build an education system that is flexible and able to offer people the skills and education and training that they need.
I think that's a great note to end the Q&A on, because I think that reflects not just on the 16 to 18 system, but really on the English education system as a whole. Imran, thank you so much for such an informative and enjoyable talk. And thank you to everybody watching online for joining us today and for putting your questions in Slido. I know we didn't quite get to all of them. There were lots there and lots of really interesting points there. The chart you've been looking for is in there. The other recommendation I have, of course, is to join us next week on Tuesday at 1 p.m. for the next talk in our Festival of Social Science series on why and how should developing countries raise more taxes. We hope to see you there, but in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day.